Battery cells. In this video, we'll be looking at e-bike battery cells and their formats, chemistries, identification, capabilities, and charging and discharging. Why it matters? Because it's fundamental to understanding e-bike battery packs and safe part selection. Prerequisite VODs. The one on voltage, current, and resistance, watts, amp hours, and watt hours, and electrical circuits. Let's begin with what is a cell. Cells are an individual battery of which many make up an e-bike battery pack, as pictured here. They come in two common flavors for e-bikes, 18650 and 21700. So 18650 refers to 18, the diameter of the cell can, and 65, the length, same as the 21700. It is 21 millimeters in diameter and 70 millimeters in length. Not always, but sometimes the manufacturers will drop the O on the end to reflect the actual measurements. Cell anatomy. Battery cells can come in all shapes and sizes, but for e-bikes they are usually in the cylindrical shape. It's a large roll pressed into a steel or aluminium container. This cylindrical format is the most common used in e-bike packs. Here we have a diagram just labeling all the parts inside the cell, and this is the same thing as a cut cross-section. Deciphering cells. Starting with the prefix. It's not critical, but it's nice to know. It's this part here. INR or ICR or NCR basically means a mix of lithium, nickel, and cobalt, which ends up being most cells. IFR, which is lithium iron phosphate round cell, and IMR, which is lithium manganese round cell. These ones are a little bit more rare, but iron phosphate is becoming more common. Next up on the cell label, we've got the size. It's the approximate cell diameter and length. It varies from cell to cell. So our common formats were 18650 and 21700. But here they've got them labeled as 18650, which is actually 18.2 millimeters by 64.8 for that particular cell, and 22-71, even though it's got the 21700 label on it later. This is more a approximation of its dimensions here. For some reason, they've decided to put this size right after that prefix. As you'll soon discover, all cells are labeled slightly differently. Next up is the model number, sometimes references size or capacity. In this case, it's shorthand for capacity, and the bottom one, it's referencing a size format. Then after that, we have the brand. This one's branded as Samsung, SDI, and this one Ampace. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you may come across, things like the date or the batch codes, serial numbers, specs, polarity, the internal QR codes they use in the factory. All of these things you don't really need to worry too much about unless you're delving deep into cell research. But you might be asking, okay, why teach this? Well, you need to be able to identify cells, and the easiest way to do that is usually by the brand name followed by the model number. So here, for instance, we have Samsung 30Qs, and here we have Ampace 21700As. And why is it important? Because you want to identify cells to understand true pack level capabilities, and if you need to match replacements, you need to get a like for like cell. Speaking of which, watch out for fakes and B-grade cells. When manufacturers do large production runs, sometimes not all of the cells make the standardized tests. The few cells that don't make those tests usually get sold onto the Chinese market and listed as B-grade. Sometimes these sellers can be a little bit disingenuous and they market the cells as genuine, authentic, and A-grade when they are actually B-grade. Even worse than that, they may have a completely different cell entirely and rewrap or relabel it. So, when you are purchasing cells, you need to look for trusted sources or at least test and compare to the cell datasheet. Easy things you can look for is the cell weight accurate, is the internal resistance accurate, we'll cover what that is later, and does the cell meet the capacity requirements. If you want a detailed article on how to spot cell fakes and just how sophisticated they can be, check out the link through this QR code. Since the time of recording this earlier, a new standard has come out. It's called the China Compulsory Certification. This is the CCC mark, as shown here. It's China's version of the CE, European, or UL, US safety standards. Basically, the standard requires the cells and other related electronics with the mark have independent safety testing. This was enforced post-August 2024, meaning that any battery cells that did not have the mark in China could not be sold or used commercially. Another requirement of this mark is to have the minimum guaranteed capacity printed on the cell. However, that guaranteed capacity is always based off the cell's datasheet or the manufacturer specs. So if you plan on using a high discharge cell like this moly cell, you may still get less capacity than what's actually printed if you are demanding a lot of current from the cell. But that's only really a concern for high power builds. In our example here, we have the moly cell P45B. This was pre-China compulsory standards labeling, and you can see that there's a lot less on the cell, whereas the same cell with a more modern version has a lot more information printed on the wrap. To summarize, CCC is important to look for if you are buying cells out of China. It just means that there's extra steps that have gone into ensuring that you're getting a somewhat safe and decent battery cell. Curious to find out more, simply search China Compulsory Certification. Quality cell brands. If you're curious who makes good cells around the world, here's a list. Anything with an asterisk on it is usually focused more on the car scale, so they might do different shapes and styles of cells compared to what we've covered. There's a lot of Chinese companies in here as well. There are a lot of good things that come out of China. There's been massive incentives from the Chinese government to help develop cells in the country and become leaders in battery technology. So despite the disguised fakes and B grades out there, there are some really good quality A grade stuff too. Despite this, OEM brands tend to stick with Samsung, LG Chem, Sony and Panasonic. However, we are actually seeing some better cells come out now from the likes of Molicel and Ampace. If you want a larger list, check out the link through this QR code. Some quick advice, look for verified purchaser reviews and tests, buy test sample quantities if you're unsure instead of a whole batch to begin with, and in-country resellers are usually good, but they do have their markup of course. Now, instead of doing a global list, because suppliers change all the time, you might have to just go do your own research on who is a good battery reseller near you. For further advice on purchasing e-bike batteries, check out this article and this QR code here. Some more key terms before we move on. Cell chemistry, it's the active ingredients that make up the cell, kind of looks like this powdery stuff. And charge cycles. One cycle is a full charge and discharge within the cell's intended voltage range. Cell chemistries. Now there is a lot to go over here. So what I'll do is I'll just glance over at high level, and if you want, you can pause the video and look and compare each of the specs yourself. Starting with NMC. This is a family of battery chemistry that has a combination of lithium, nickel and cobalt in it. It's probably the most mature chemistry out of the lot, and it is used widely across e-bikes, EVs, grid storage, aerospace, and medical. The advantages of this chemistry, it's very modern, and even though it's got 3 stars for safety, modern cells are still very safe. It's an average cost with a lower amount of life cycles, but you can still get very power dense and very energy dense cells. Moving on to LFP, or lithium iron phosphate, this battery chemistry now dominates EVs and grid storage. The energy density and power density, it's not quite as good as NMC, but the cost is much lower. And the cycle time, so the overall lifespan of the battery, is much higher, and it tends to have better safety as well. LFP, however, is being hotly contended by sodium ion. This is a newer technology that gets rid of the lithium component altogether. The only reason why it's not cheaper than lithium iron phosphate is because the manufacturing lines around the world are more spun up to deal with these two chemistries, but once manufacturing scales up for sodium ion, it will become cheaper. And comparably, you have pretty similar specs when it comes to power, energy, density, safety, and cost and lifespan. Moving on to some high performers, you have LTO or lithium titanate. These are very interesting. These batteries are kind of like the definition of party hard and go home early. They are some of the least energy dense, so big heavy bricks with not much juice in them, but they tend to get rid of that juice very quickly. Think of them as your absolute best Usain Bolt sprinters compared to your more marathon and middle distance runners. The downside is they're very expensive, but the upside to them is they are extremely safe. They don't even catch fire when you put a power drill through them, and with that many cycles, up to 50 years plus, it's ridiculous. And so they're used in usually things like some fast charging buses and grid buffers to be able to dump and store a lot of energy very quick. And finally, SSB, solid state batteries, a family of batteries rather than a particular chemistry. It tends to be pretty new tech at this time anyway, of May 26. Now, the promise of solid state batteries, once optimized, they'd beat everything else in all of the categories, including cost. However, it's super early days, so that's why to be determined is pretty much after every single spec, because we just don't know yet. There's not enough testing out there. But to summarize, in e-bikes, you're almost always going to see NMC, but as time goes on, these chemistries may become more relevant as they get more energy dense and they can fit more into an e-bike form factor. Just a quick note on thermal stability. The cells of these various chemistries and families, they're most efficient at ambient temperature. Below freezing usually means reduced capacity and slower charge rates. Temperature limits will vary, so you want to check the cell's datasheet. Now here I've just put what I recommend for a safe range for charging these various different chemistries and discharging, but again, make sure you check the datasheet. And for my friends that like their freedom units, here's everything in Fahrenheit. Moving on to more key terms. Nominal voltage, the reference voltage of an e-bike battery, cell, or pack. C rating, a cell's charge and dischargeability divided by its rated capacity. In this example, we're going to assume that's the same number. In most cells, they're actually not, but for this example, it's 7 amps, and then we divide that by 3,500 milliamp hours, or 3.5 amp hours. So essentially that is 7 divided by 3.5, and that would give the cell a rating of 2C. Moving on to cell discharging. Cell capabilities can be specified with CDR, which is the continuous discharge rate, discharge until X temperature, or peak discharge in X amount of seconds. It's either specified in amps, A, or its C rating, which we just covered in C. Our example here is we have a Molicel P50B, which has a 60 amp continuous rated discharge until 80 Celsius. Or, if we want to find out its C rating, 60 amps divided by 5 amp hours equals 12C. And that's where we found the information on its datasheet. So depending on the cell's chemistry, it may be different on how it charges and discharge. For here we have our normal lithium-ion chemistry, which tops out at 4.2 volts per cell and basically ends at around 2.5 volts, with a nominal or rated capacity of 3.6 volts. And here's a typical discharge curve of the cell. It's pretty even and then slopes off at the end, with a greater drop in voltage if there's more power being pulled from the cell at once. Lithium ion phosphate chemistry, however, is a flat discharge curve. Starts at 3.65, 3.2 nominal, and 2.5 flat. So this one, you have a bit of a drop, and then it almost stays always the same until it just drops off a cliff at the end. This is one of the reasons why you don't really see this too much in an e-bike, because they usually have their battery indicators pegged to a voltage. So it may confuse someone if they're riding 90% of the time and their battery appears almost full and then suddenly it becomes empty. And then you have sodium ion chemistry. It behaves really nicely in terms of its discharge curve. It's 4 volts 100%, 3 volts nominal, and 2 volts is what the discharge curve looks like here. Pretty even, and then a slight plateau and then drop off. Unlike the other two, this one can actually be discharged all the way down to 0 volts without damaging it. So you may come across cells that are the same size, but sometimes there are trade-offs. So take these two models for example. They're both Samsung cells. One is designed for high capacity or energy density, so you can think of that as a marathon runner, and the other one's high discharge, think of that as a sprint. So this marathon runner, if you put it under heaps of load, its voltage is going to drop a lot and it's going to get very hot. Whereas this one, if you put it under a lot of load, it's going to be able to manage it a lot more easily. However, under a small amount of load, this guy is going to last a lot longer. And here's a couple more key terms before we move on to lifespan. SOH, expressed as a percentage, is the state of health or how much original capacity a cell or a battery hold. State of charge, or SOC, is how much remaining capacity is left at any given time. Sometimes in the industry, SOC is used in place of SOH, but it is important to know that there's a difference between the two. So let's look at cell lifespan. It's the drop in capacity over many cycles. It varies based on the C rate, and there's no standardized test for end of life. So each manufacturer will rate its cell lifespan differently. For instance, we have this Ampace cell here, and we can see if it's been used gently with a 2 amp charge and a 12 amp discharge over 1500 cycles, it'll have 80% plus capacity remaining. But if you use it in more of a brutal fashion with an 8 amp charge and a 40 amp continuous discharge, it'll only take 400 cycles to drop to 60% plus capacity remaining. In an upcoming video, we can actually look at what this is like on a pack level and see how hard we push our cells and how long they will last. Now, in the real world, Batteries aren't always fully charged and fully discharged. Sometimes it might be a partial cycle. And the closer the cell is charged and discharged to its nominal voltage usually means it can have more cycles. So TLDR, sometimes you can get more lifespan out of your cells if you don't fully charge and discharge them. But in practice, most e-bike chargers are not built that way. Therefore, advanced or programmable chargers can also extend lifespan but are not critical. Some packs are actually programmed to balance the cells in the 90 to 100% range, and they may degrade if not balanced over a long period of time. More on what balancing is soon. More key terms to consider. Voltage, sag, or spike. It's the initial change in voltage when a cell is charging or discharging. And IR is the internal resistance of a cell, usually expressed as milliohms. If you look at a cell just by itself, the greater the internal resistance, the greater the voltage sag.
Hi, Future Dave here. I just wanted to show you this. Internal resistance measuring is more accurately done when using an AC tester. The direct current testing is heavily influenced by the cell's voltage, and you'll find with a DC tester when you plug it into the machine, it actually shows you a different result each time that can vary quite a bit. Whereas an AC tester sends a 1 kHz pulse through the battery and gives you a very accurate reading. Long story short, a tool like this can be fantastic if you're getting into battery specialization. Okay, now back to earlier, Dave.
Cell voltage sag. Remember, car speed is like voltage. Voltage sag is like cars slowing down as they merge lanes. And when the load is released, the lanes are opening back up and traffic speeds back up. So here we have a visual example of that. 25% output is 4 lanes, cars are moving fast, then we ramp it up to 100, now there's only 2 lanes, so they slow right down. And then we release it back to 50% and there's more lanes, but not as much as there was at 25% throttle. Voltage decreases under load. We've just illustrated that here. The lower the internal resistance, the lower the voltage sag or wasted heat. On e-bikes, the sag can confuse the end user. Now what I mean by that is if you ever had a customer say, hey, on my display there's a little battery blip and when I accelerate it suddenly disappears, and what is it doing? Do I have a bad battery? And when I go back to coasting it might reappear again. That is voltage sag and it's perfectly normal. Illustrating here with this 2 different batteries, we have our voltage and time, and when we put a massive load on the battery, the voltage starts at 4.2 but immediately drops to around about 3.8, 3.7, and this one drops even further to about 3.6, 3.5. So this battery will have the higher internal resistance. And this is how it looks over time. Say if you have a current that is 0 coasting and then whack around about 25 amps and then back to coasting, then 25 amps and back to coasting. This would just be like a sudden burst of acceleration, then a release. You have this drop in voltage and then it recovers and another drop and recovers, but each time it's not recovering as much and it will eventually go flat. Here's a video of what voltage sag looks like at a pack level. This battery is almost fully charged. I'm about to apply 300 watts of load to it. If you look to the top of the screen where it says VOL in yellow, where it says 41.47 volts, pay attention to that as I start the tester. What you'll notice is the immediate drop to around about 40 volts, but it will continue to hold steady and slowly drain after that. Then we have voltage spike, which is the reverse of voltage sag. So when you stick it into the charger, you might get a sudden jump in voltage. This usually happens when you plug in the charger or if your bike is regenerative braking enabled. But the very astute among you might wonder what happens if your bike is already full and then you try to regen brake. Well, luckily the controllers are smart enough to disable that so you don't get overcharging in your battery pack at full voltage. Next key term, CCCV, which means constant current, constant voltage. It's the most common charging protocol used to safely charge an e-bike cells and batteries. CCCV, constant current and constant voltage, we've just covered that. It's used on lithium ion phosphate and sodium ion batteries. There's a cell voltage spike with constant current, and when it's near full, that switches to decrease amps and keep a constant voltage instead of a constant current. Now I know that sounds confusing, but it's okay. I'm going to show you what that looks like visually in just a second. The cell charging speed depends on capacity, chemistry, and technology. times can vary from 6 minutes all the way up to 2 hours per cell. And at a pack level, this can be even longer, but we'll go into that when we cover battery packs. So here's a lithium-ion battery, and on this side we have constant current mode. So we see the voltage climbing, and once it goes to this point here, where it's at 4.2 volts, it switches to constant voltage to sustain that. And then we see the current drop off, so it stays at that voltage, and then once it's ended, we'll see the voltage drop just slightly as the electrons settle. Same thing with the lithium iron phosphate cell. We've got a constant current which goes all the way to this black line here, and then it suddenly switches to constant voltage, but that portion is much shorter before the charging ends. And you'll notice also that the voltage drops quite a bit after the charges end once the electrons settle. Just goes to show different chemistries have different charging behavior. I don't have one for sodium ion just yet, just because it is such a new technology, and I couldn't find any cells on the site with that chemistry that have been tested. So lastly, if you're curious about different cell tests and how they all perform compared to each other, you can check out these different websites and different databases. They're all fantastic and can help you in identifying and finding the cells that you need.
Click here to watch the next video. It is the best free thing you can do to tell YouTube to support the channel. Otherwise, if you want to do more, check out the links in the description. Thanks for watching.